Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Clement Sedmak, and I serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Before we begin this evening, please allow me to point out a few practicalities, and I have a script for that I don't forget. First of all, we are having a drawing for 3 autographed copies of our esteemed speaker's memoir, recently published in English. It is an amazing book that begins with the sentence, "In my lifetime, I have lived several lives." If you have not signed up for the drawing, please do so with one of my colleagues, like Chen in the corner to my left. We will announce the winner at the end of the lecture. The winner will be selected by a random number generator, which is not romantic, but a sign that we have embraced the 21st century understanding of fairness. If you do not win, please be happy for the winner and please consider purchasing a copy of Myroslav Marinovic's memoirs afterwards. Secondly, a gentle reminder to please ensure your various electronic devices are set to silent mode, from cell phones to pacemakers. Miroslav will take us to new heights of hope and faith. Please put your devices in airplane mode. Many thanks. Thirdly, we are video recording the lecture today. That is why I will repeat my name again in a second. We will be taking questions at the end. Miroslav will speak for about 45, 48, 50 minutes. And afterwards, there is time for maybe 10 minutes Q&A. To ensure that your questions can be heard in the recording, we will ask you please to use the microphones. Following the tradition of the Nanovic Institute, the first question will go to a student. No pressure, but I may know some students and might call on you. So let us begin. Welcome to the 2021 Nanovic Forum lecture. My name is still Clement Sedmak, and I still serve as director of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. The Nanovic Forum is the annual signature event of the Nanovic Institute. And I'm so delighted to be able to welcome our speaker in person and not via a screen. The Nanovic Forum lecture series is a particular gift of Robert and Elizabeth Nanovic. Sadly, Bob and Liz cannot be with us in person tonight, but they will receive the video recording, and we are sending our grateful greetings. Bob and Liz have created our institute with an inspiring vision, have generously provided for this lecture, and have also supported the construction of Nanovic Hall. Big thank you to Bob and Liz. Present with us this afternoon is also our Dean, Scott Appleby from the Keough School of Global Affairs. I'm so grateful that you are here with your wonderful wife, Barb, carving out time of a very, very busy schedule. Thank you so much, Scott. Present with us this evening are also members of the Nanovic Institute's advisory board. The board will meet tomorrow. I'm already very excited. I try not to show that. I want to particularly welcome the chair, the wonderful chair of our advisory board, or the chair of our wonderful advisory board, Jane Hayden. Thank you for being with us. We are grateful to our advisory board members for their support. Welcome to you all, colleagues, students, friends to be, and friends. It is my pleasure to introduce our Nanovic Forum speaker. Miroslav Marinovic is a human rights activist and Gulag survivor. In an interview, he talked about the dissident movement and described it as such. The dissident movement was, above all, a moral movement. We had no other means except morally not accepting what was around. If in everything else, we lost. Miroslav stands here as a witness to the power of moral convictions. He was involved in the Brezhnev-era human rights movement in the Soviet Union, and because of that, he spent a decade as a political prisoner in Siberia and in internal exile. He emerged with strong spirits and unbroken. His spirit remained strong because he knew why he was suffering in prison and in exile. He was standing on firm moral grounds. And these moral grounds had and still have a spiritual foundation. In his memoirs, The Universe Behind Barbed Wire, Memoirs of Ukrainian Soviet Dissident, published with University of Rochester Press 2021, Miroslav writes, "For the longest time, I've had the feeling that every person is just one musical note on the heavenly keyboard. It is indeed a miracle when you are the note that is required in God's melody. This is beautiful and encouraging. This is a belief in the importance of each and every person in the spirit of integral human development that we embrace at the KIO School. John Henry Newman once reflected on the vision that God has a plan and that each person has a role in this plan, and that a wonderful plan will only be realized if each and everyone plays their part. The heavenly melody Miroslav is writing about can only happen if we all become part of the mission to serve for the greater glory of God. Carried by this faith, Miroslav became a founding member of the Ukrainian Helsinki Group and a prisoner of conscience. He headed the Amnesty International structures in Ukraine between 1991 and 1996, and he was president of the Ukrainian Center of the PEN International. Today, Myroslav serves as vice-rector for university mission and as president of the Institute of Religion and Society at Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Ukraine. He is a source of inspiration, wisdom, encouragement, and resilience. The Ukrainian Catholic University is one of the strongest partners of the Nanovic Institute for European Studies. Miroslav will deepen our understanding of Europe and of faith. He will reflect on the deepest source of our strength in a talk entitled Faith in Communist and Post-Communist Europe. Dear Miroslav, thank you so much for being with us tonight. The floor is all yours, and your papers are still there.
Sorry, I want to fix this so it doesn't.
No.
Is that okay? No?
I will keep it.
Like that. Okay.
It was prepared already.
Sorry, but it's in the shot. Okay, how's that?
Okay, thank you. Dear Reverend clergy, honored members of the Nanovic family, members of the Nanovic Institute's advisory board, esteemed colleagues, members of the Notre Dame community, distinguished guests, and especially dear students, glory to Christ. I truly thank the Nanovic Institute of the University of Notre Dame for this opportunity to share with you my personal testimonies and reflections on religious faith in communist and post-communist Europe. I will, of course, rely on the experience of Ukraine. While preparing this speech, I myself was amazed how many epochs of its history unfolded before my eyes. Of course, I didn't see the brutal attack on religion by the early Bolsheviks, but I did see the tragic fate of my grandfather, a Greek Catholic priest, who fell victim to state proselytism during the post-war reprisals against the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. As a young schoolboy, each year on Good Friday, I tried to sneak my way to the ceremonial shroud displayed in church, a beautiful relic meant to depict the crucified Lord after he was removed from the cross and shrouded in the linens of St. Joseph, Arimathea. To do this, I had to bypass teachers' pickets from all schools in the city set up by the authorities to register students who disobeyed the ban on attending any religious services. In my early youth, I heard the anti-religious rhetoric of the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, who promised to show the last Soviet priest on television in 1975. During my student days, I had to defend my classmate, whom the university administration was trying to punish for getting married in a church. And during my imprisonment in the 1970s and 1980s, I experienced a total and brutal ban on worshipping in any religious cult in a labor camp. However, I will talk about that separately. Fortunately, this litany of abuses was cut short because during the 30 years of Ukraine's independence, I have experienced the establishment of full-fledged religious freedom in the country, which remains one of the greatest achievements of Ukrainian democracy. Having witnessed so many somersaults in the religious history of my land, I give myself the moral right to make certain generalizations that will enable us to trace both the tragic kidnapping of Eastern Europe by the communist Zeus and its turbulent return to the family of European nations. So, on the religious aspects of communism briefly. From a religious perspective, communism was a huge mutation of the human spirit. The anti-world triumphantly invaded the ordinary world civilization. With its special spiritual parameters, which literally undermined the spiritual homeostasis of mankind. For the first time in the history of human civilization, people massively transferred what belonged to God, not to another god or gods, as has often been the case in the past, as a result of the conquests of one people by another, but a transfer of religious devotion to a godless earthly Caesar. Hence, he began to be deified. Nothing confirms the indestructibility, the resiliency of religious feeling as much as the experience of communism. A brief recollection. When I wanted to quote Lenin's well-known phrase at my court hearing, the judge interrupted me with the sacramental words, "Stop pronouncing the holy name of Lenin. It sounds like a sacrilege in your mouth." However, the quasi-religiosity of the communist faith did not prevent it from being openly anti-Christian. The famous Bolshevik Anatoly Lunacharsky claimed, I quote, "Christian love is an obstacle to the spread of our revolution. Away with love of neighbor. What we need is hatred. We must learn to hate because only then can we gain the world." End quote. That is why the French philosopher Alain Besançon asked a simple question: who was in power under the Nazi and communist regimes? And he himself answered it. It was the devil. Having developed its form of quasi-religion, communism became a spiritual and worldly monster that turned Eastern Europe into the bloodlands, as they were aptly described by Yale historian Timothy Snyder. The mass extermination of believers, the destruction of religious symbols and shrines, the relativization of morality. Moral is what is beneficial to the proletariat. The apology of violence and the class nature of ethics, all these ruined the spiritual world of man. That is why I formulated a rather risky thesis that the greatest victims of communism were not those who were killed by it, but those who remained alive. the so-called Homo Sovieticus, with meddled minds, frozen hearts, and a broken moral backbone. For they could survive only by doing what I said at the beginning, by bringing to Caesar what rightfully belonged to God. What was happening on Ukrainian soil was paradigmatic for all the bloodlands in the east of the continent. Therefore, the 20th century is a time not only of abduction, but also of the spiritual decline of Eastern Europe. Religious experience of the Gulag. Let me invite you now to the Brezhnev-era labor camp number 36 in the village of Kuchino, Perm region of the Russian Federation, where I was personally detained from 1978 to 1984. As I described that in my book, The Universe Behind Barbed Wire, conducting religious services of any kind was strictly forbidden in the Soviet penitentiary system. With reference to Marx's famous phrase that religion is the opium for the masses, one might say the Soviet prisoners were diligently protected from this drug dependency. Nevertheless, fortunately, the Holy Spirit did not comply with the camp guidelines and managed to show up everywhere and anytime he wanted. In their memoirs, most prisoners of conscience note that their spiritual life in the camp was intense and rich. For me personally, the period of imprisonment was a time when the nerve of my soul was especially sensitive to the problems of good and evil, and sufferings made the presence of God almost visible. We all know Jesus' famous phrase, "I was in prison and you came to me," Matthew 25:36. So God is the first to do what he advises us to do, and therefore he comes to all who suffer innocently. Later I read the wonderful words of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic holy martyr, Father Omelian Koch, who died in the Nazi concentration camp at Majdanek. I quote, "Apart from the heavens, this is the only place I would like to be. Here we are all equal, Poles, Jews, Ukrainians, Russians, Latvians, Estonians. Here I see God, who is one and the same for all." End quote. I can only confirm the validity of these words on the basis of experience in Soviet concentration camp. The feeling of God's presence simply pushed you to immerse yourself in His Word. And how to do it when prisoners were strictly forbidden to have a Bible or prayer books in their cells? They say there was only one time during the Stalin era when a Bible and a Quran made it into the cells, when Eleanor Roosevelt came to visit and asked to see the prison conditions. Immediately after her visit, those books quickly disappeared. So, to circumvent the ban, I arranged with my friend, who was to be released soon, to rewrite the Sermon on the Mount for me and send it by letter. However, the camp censor confiscated this letter as suspicious in content, and you would see the happy face of a KGB officer who was proud to have detected this attempted crime in time. Then I took a radical step, a long hunger strike claiming the right to receive a Bible. In vain. All I had to do was read Leo Taxil's atheistic funny gospel, offered by the camp library. The value of this book was that there were occasional quotes from the true gospel. However, I received perhaps the greatest experience of faith from reading my soul during camp challenges and from communicating with my fellow prisoners, whose spiritual lessons became my second university. One of the most characteristic signs of the religious life of Christians in the camps was the minimal attention paid to confessional differences. The essential point was, how strong is your faith? There are a number of explanations for this fact. First, most of the prisoners were spiritually formed in an atheist Soviet society and had only a general notion about the ecclesial traditions with which they identified themselves. Second, because a central tenet of the communist ideology was its strong anti-religious orientation, to declare oneself a believer was in itself an act of resistance and free self-expression. To specify a concrete confession was not that important. That's why a very specific type of spontaneous ecumenism developed. Third, the camp administration found it much more difficult to harm prisoners for their participation in religious activity if the prisoners acted in unison. Thus, for this reason, we celebrated Christmas twice, according to both the Western, Gregorian, and Eastern Julian calendars. Easter was also celebrated twice. Punishments had a non-confessional nature too. Orthodox and Greek Catholics, Roman Catholics, and Protestants suffered without distinction. At least this was the case when, in 1982, all participants of a collective prayer at Easter were punished. Even the Jew Leonid Lubman, who came to support his Christian friends, was selected. The main organizers, that is, the Orthodox Victor Nekipelo, the agnostic Mykola Rudenko, and the Greek Catholic author of this text, were detained to the so-called karcer, the punitive isolation cell, usually a damp, cemented-walled isolation cell where prisoners were kept for up to 60 days in frigid conditions without any warm clothing or bed covers, where they slept on a bare wooden rack and were served starvation rations. Still, for a Christian, it is always a special blessing to suffer for Christ. So we took our punishment with a clear soul. In the cell, it immediately occurred to us that all Christians in the world should be informed about this case, the punishment for common prayer. This was the time when the Soviet Union financially and informationally supported the so-called Christian peace marches in Europe. So we wanted these Christians to know, on the one hand, the Soviet Union supported them, and on the other, they punished Christians simply for praying at Easter. We managed to secretly release our letter to the Holy Father John Paul II, and after a while, an encrypted message arrived at the camp. The Pope received the letter and prayed for you during the Mass in the Vatican. Our joy knew no bounds. The camp gave an opportunity to look into the soul of the representatives of the camp administration. One day I went to visit my friend, the Russian poet Viktor Nekipelo, who was lying seriously ill in separate medical barracks. Seeing his suffering, I removed the body cross from my neck and gave it to him. Victor put it on with a special and thrilling feeling, as if it were his renewed baptism. And the next day, I learned from him that when the camp physician Pchelnikov came to the camp for inspection and saw that cross, he sneezed and exclaimed, "I refuse to treat you. Let him treat you," and pointed to the cross. It is difficult to even say what struck me more in this episode. The complete incompatibility of the position of this doctor with the Hippocratic oath, or a kind of recognition by the atheist that God still exists. Summing up this part, I will say what at first glance seems to be paradoxical. The political camp, a place where forgiving your enemies was the most difficult, became for religiously oriented prisoners a place of testing and affirmation of their faith. The process wasn't linear and simple, of course, but even our failures seem to have spiritual significance. Prisoners of conscience have a clear awareness of their innocence. Their rebellion against the laws of their state was not a rebellion against the principle of the rule of law. The feeling that you were punished for the truth directly led a prisoner to the grace of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are they who are persecuted because of God's way. Matthew 5:10. That feeling gave the prisoner extraordinary spiritual power and became a reliable backbone. However, in my case, there was some specific nuance. I realized the meaning of this blessing only when I left the camp and read the Bible. But then their circumstances had already changed, and in order to earn this grace of God, I had to work hard. New reality, reimplanting of faith. So now let's try to understand what happened in the religious field of Eastern Europe when the Soviet Union collapsed, again using the example of Ukraine. In the late 80s, believers hoped that aggressive communist atheism in society would be replaced by its alternative, that is, an intensive church life. At first, it was so. It was truly the reimplanting of faith. However, it quickly became clear that the real trends are far from what was expected. Instead of turning to the pre-communist past with its unambiguous and historically determined ecclesiastical affiliation, what was established in society was secularism, pluralism, and consequently the fragmentation of Christianity. In the 1980s, people sought freedom of religion because they sought religious freedom for their own church. In the early 90s, when religious freedom extended not only to our correct church, but also to wrong and heretical communities, some Christians became agitated. Religious freedom has been accused of spreading heresies. It took 30 years of experiencing religious freedom to feel how blessed it is for normal religious life. An important test of maturity for Ukraine was President Viktor Yanukovych's attempt to introduce the Russian model of favoring one church in the country. During the Revolution of Dignity of the year 2013-14, Ukrainian society strongly rejected this model, and since then, religious freedom has become not only the fruit of democracy, but also an important guarantor of it. Overcoming the effects of the communist trauma was not easy in other areas also. On the one hand, it was difficult for officials to immediately get rid of the old habit of instrumentalizing the church for their own political needs. On the other hand, some religious communities did not mind using the power of state to fight their rivals. The experience gained in overcoming these vestiges of the past was painful, but still positive and largely successful. The main precondition for success was the fact that no denomination in Ukraine is strong enough to monopolize state influence, and no one is weak enough for the state to ignore its interests. Thus, confessional and jurisdictional pluralism became an important school of tolerance and cooperation. Georgetown professor Jose Casanova explained that in quite a remarkable way. I quote, "In less than 2 decades, Ukraine has formed the most diverse and transparent competitive religious system in Europe. Indeed, we can say that Ukraine is the only European country that is approaching the American model of religious denominationalism." End quote. The increase in the spiritual maturity of Ukrainian society became evident during the pilgrimage of St. John Paul II to Ukraine in St. Pope John Paul II to Ukraine in the year 2001. Vatican diplomats later said they were truly impressed by the sacrifice and sincere piety of the 1 million Greek Catholic congregation during the Divine Liturgy with the Pope in Lviv. The maturity was most evident during the 2 Maidans, or the Orange Revolution of the year 2004, and the Revolution of Dignity of the year 2013-14. It was a mass uprising against the government's attempts to manipulate electoral rights of people or undermine their national interests, and the spiritual potential of these revolutions was enormous. It was the unity of representatives of all ethnic groups and all religions around a common value, human dignity. Another important event took place during the Revolution of Dignity. On the night of November 30, the year 2013, when on President Yanukovych's order, riot police went on the offensive to disperse the protest Maidan, St. Michael's Cathedral of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Kievan Patriarchate opened its gates to the persecuted and bloodied Maidan activists. That night, it looked like the ancient darkened icon had suddenly restored its colors in the minds of Ukrainians. The church again began to be perceived as a shelter, a refuge, a sanctuary. After that, the participants of the Revolution of Dignity opened their protest square to the presence of religious preachers. The Greek Catholic chaplains of the Maidan organized an ecumenical prayer tent, and since then the protest Maidan has become a place of amazing personal conversions, and spiritual insights. In the year 2018, another event took place which marked the further liberation of Ukraine from the captivity of the communist empire. Starting from 1930, when the communist regime forcibly liquidated the Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church, the authorities immediately thwarted any attempts by Ukrainian Orthodox believers to become independent of the Moscow Patriarchate. The so-called Unification Council of the year 2018 legalized these efforts toward independence and proclaimed the creation of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, which is now in Eucharistic communion with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Fortunately, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew understood all the injustice of the political and imperial motivations of patriarchal Moscow and granted the Orthodox Church in Ukraine a canonical status and a Tomos of autocephaly. By doing so, he restored the rights of the Church of Constantinople, which was the mother church for the historical Church of Kiev. Of course, what has become a feast for Ukrainian Orthodoxy has become for Vladimir Putin a second geopolitical catastrophe, this time not on the scale of a century, but that of a millennium. Can we say that through these important successes of Ukrainian Christians, the legacy of communism has been finally overcome? Obviously not. Today, our personal and public lives are still not based on sound and strong moral foundations. And without them, even the most modern political models and technologies we have borrowed from the West will be ineffective. Quasi-communist values of survival are still dominant in society, and they fuel the old social contract. This is becoming a weight that slows down our development. That is why the Church is called to reveal these false cultural codes and to target them. This is the uniqueness of her mission, because no one will do it for her. That is why Christians, bishops, priests, religious, and laity must take responsibility for the condition of their country, because they are called to be salt, the salt or leaven of the kingdom of God. The time when the Ukrainian churches had to rebuild their structures after the fall of communism is over. Today, the spiritual fruits of its service must appear on the restored branches of the Church. From this perspective, activities of the Ukrainian Catholic University are truly missionary in nature and contribute to the re-establishment of Christian values in society. UKU argues that in a society where the word religious is often synonymous with the word archaic, being a religiously oriented university does not prevent it from being a modern university. UKU truly belongs to the brightest modern phenomena of the country. In Ukraine, there is a persistent stereotype that living honestly means becoming a loser. Thus, UKU has proved that being a value-based university does not prevent us from being an effective institution. Instead of losing our chances, as some believe, we multiply them. Finally, UKU has become a meeting place for the secular and religious segments of Ukrainian society. As a promoter of values, it has become a place of soft evangelization for those who have never encountered a religious tradition before. It is difficult for Ukrainian Christians to find a solution to another dilemma. On the one hand, the Church belongs to eternity, and therefore maintaining continuity of church traditions is part of our mission. I personally feel awe when I realize that I'm praying during the same liturgy that existed in the time of John Chrysostom. On the other hand, fidelity to tradition easily passes into the trap of traditionalist ritualism, from which the evangelical content of our faith suffers. As Yaroslav Pelikan stated, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. Ukrainian Christians also do not always understand how to preserve themselves in a time of frantic acceleration of time, which brings with it enormous spiritual challenges. A purely defensive position leads to temptation of finding shelter and comfort in the creation of a parallel society, better and more spiritual than it was until now. So you can find yourself in a ghetto created by yourself and lose once again. In addition, such an attitude makes the Church a participant in today's cultural wars around the globe, when the truth dissolves between two mutually exclusive extremes. However, participation in cultural wars is not the mission of the Church. On the contrary, she is called to extinguish these wars by reconciling all in the truth of Christ's love. That is why one of the pioneers of ecumenism, Father Paul Couturier, concluded, I quote, "God cannot first bring about the unity of minds in truth, and only then the unity of hearts in love. Psychologically, that is, in the order of implementation, the opposite will be true. Controversy, on the contrary, closes souls to the breath of the Holy Spirit, because people immediately take a defensive position. And here we have two camps against each other." End quote. We have to admit that the optimism of the annus mirabilis 1989 in the world has also dissipated. And it is not so much politics as such that is to be blamed, but the degradation of the value platform on which this world rested. Today, it is obvious that traditional ethics fall within all Christian communities, Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant. According to Thomas Friedman, Hindus and Confucians now have more Protestant ethics than we do. For a long time, the consequences of such degradation were manageable. But today, the cumulative effect of the accumulation of negative changes is turning into a real crisis. You cannot hide yourself from the modern barbarism behind high walls, because it is inside us, and we bring it with us to the place where we try to find spiritual refuge. But the kingdom of God is also within us. It just needs to be revealed. One of the possible ways to do this was expressed by Metropolitan Andrei Sheptytsky. During the Second World War, that is, during the complete disturbance of souls and minds, he returned his church people to the foundation of the foundations, to the Judeo-Christian Decalogue. On his initiative, the bishops, priests, and monastics of the Lviv Archdiocese of the Greek Catholic Church began to discuss the commandments of this dialogue one by one at the annual Archdiocesan Council. This dialogue was not abstract or purely philosophical. On the contrary, Sheptytsky challenged Catholic clergy and laity to provide sanctuary and to shelter their Jewish neighbors from the Holocaust. He himself sheltered Jewish children at his residence and through a network of monasteries. Today, all Christian communities are called to such a test of conscience, because any one nation alone will not be able to cope with the current crisis. This was the conclusion of recent ecumenical initiative in Ukraine, which decided to respond to a spiritual problem that comes to the fore today in terms of its destructiveness. I mean the anti-culture of post-truth, of fake news that destroys people's ability to distinguish between truth and falsehood, between good and evil. And I will soon end. So a group of Ukrainian Christians of different denominations, including myself and several other UKU professors, published a joint document, Longing for the Truth That Makes Us Free, which tried to analyze this problem, and you can easily find the English translation on the internet under this title, Longing for the Truth That Makes Us Free. On the one hand, there is a warning there. Lowering the threshold for practicing lies inevitably leads to lowering the threshold for using hate speech. Hence, lies are difficult to overcome with logical arguments because they are reinforced by a hatred against which logic is powerless. Lying and hatred are an impetus to violence, and together they constantly push humanity into the abyss. End quote. On the other hand, we asked ourselves, what would Jesus establish against the current threat to civilization? What word would he say to today's people at this particular time? And we found the answer in verse 12:11 from the book of Revelation, and by analyzing it, we concluded, I quote, "From time to time in human history, the same magnificent event occurs. A group of people hear the call of the Holy Spirit, who is the Spirit of truth, who cleanses us from all unclean things, and overcoming the resistance of Satanism, escape the snake pit of lies. And the spiritual weapon in this struggle is Christ's word of truth, man's personal testimony, and man's readiness to sacrifice." End quote. One can, of course, discuss how well this ecumenical group has found the right Christian answer to the current global problem. However, for me personally, this document has become another important evidence that Ukrainian Christians are trying to enter into a dialogue with the world and take a position on issues that pose a threat to all of us. Therefore, I hope this document is another, albeit small, evidence that the period of ideological and spiritual kidnapping of Ukraine by the communist Zeus is coming to an end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miroslav, for this inspiring talk. Now it's on you to honor the inspiring talk with polite questions. And the idea is to have a student first. Please, could you come up to the microphone?
Hi. So you mentioned that there is now a Ukrainian autocephalous Orthodox Church that was recognized by Patriarch Bartholomew. Do you know if other autocephalous churches within the Orthodox communion have also recognized that? Because at the time, it's my understanding that it was very controversial that he did this himself without any sort of general synod or with the advice of other churches. And the fact that the Moscow Patriarchate does have the plurality within the Orthodox communion. So they're quite powerful.
Yes, you are absolutely right. There was a question whether all Orthodox churches in the world recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church autocephalous status. But I don't remember the number, but more and more Orthodox churches do recognize our church, and there is a hope. So you have to understand that the pressure from the Moscow Patriarchate is enormous. And some churches, Orthodox churches, are vulnerable to that pressure, and they, so to say, postpone the recognition. But because of a clear position of the Patriarch of Constantinople, the situation is becoming more and more clear and transparent. Thank you.
Thank you. Another question, please. Jen has the mic here. She would cater to your seat. Father Paul.
Thank you so much for a stimulating talk. I was wondering if you might cast your vision a little bit wider in Eastern Europe to talk about the ways Christianity operates more or less ecumenically and effectively in countries that we hear are moving towards authoritarianism with the support of Christian bodies like Poland and Hungary. Now, this is a distant perspective. I have not visited those places. But from the vantage of the Ukraine, what does the situation look like in those countries?
What is the situation?
In Poland and Hungary, from a Christian perspective.
Let me start from Poland. From the beginning of the 90s, Poland was a model country for Ukraine in many senses. But then, it was especially the case when we had some tension between Greek Catholic and Orthodox believers in Western Ukraine at the beginning of the 90s. And I remember my conversation with one Pole, and I expressed sorrow that, well, we have so many churches, it's so difficult in Ukraine, it's much more easier in Poland. And he said, oh, no. You are blessed that you have many churches, and no one is strong enough to dominate. Well, it was a shock for me at the beginning. I didn't think in this way. But later I understood the wisdom of this statement. And now the Polish church suffers an inner crisis. Of course, I am not a Pole, so I don't know the real reasons for that, but I may guess that the sort of triumphalism after the fall of communism, that we, the church, we were the one of the main conquerors of communism, it played some negative role in the position of the Poles. Now they are losing their influence. I'm sure that they will reshape their position, but at least so far we have this problem. I know very little about Hungary, but I heard here in South Bend, in Notre Dame, that the audience greeting the Pope Francis was very little, very small. I'm surprised. I don't know what it means so far, but maybe this need to rethink attitudes of churches after the fall of communism is common for all post-socialist, post-Soviet countries, including Ukraine and other countries. So, yes, the communism failed, fell, collapsed. But what about? But who is a victory? Are they churches or the Holy Spirit? In this sense, there is a small difference, and it would be good for all our churches to be humble enough and to admit that it was not we who were victorious at the beginning of the 90s. Thank you.
Thank you, Miroslav. Two more, just that you know. We have two more questions. That's my homework for you. It can be a comment. As long as it's polite, it can be a comment. Here, Emily. Afterwards, Emily.
Thank you for sharing your experience. I actually grew up in China, where there was an underground church that refused all contact with the government, and there's official church that did make compromises, that negotiate with the government, and even after the Vatican started communicating with the Chinese government, you do see the sort of tension or emotional distance between faithful that attend different churches. Did you witness a similar situation in Ukraine or Eastern Europe?
So this student grew up in China with an underground church and an official church. And these are two different types of churches. And when the Vatican started to negotiate, there would still be tensions between these two kinds of churches. Mm-hmm. Do you have a similar experience in Ukraine?
Yes and no. Because in our times, we didn't have a part of the Greek Catholic that cooperated with the communist regimes. The whole church was banned. That's why the Vatican recognized, supported, prayed for this underground church. There was some problem when our patriarch Joseph Slipy arrived in the Vatican after 18 years of imprisonment in Gulag. Then, so to say, he was asked not to speak too loudly about communism, because it was the time of Ostpolitik. So the Vatican prepared not to be too aggressive toward Russia, Soviet Union. But at the same time, the Vatican clearly supported our church. I cannot take position in the Chinese situation, but I may say openly and sincerely that I suffered when I read some interviews of these non-recognized bishops. I suffered because I might imagine them, how it is for themselves having no support except for God.
Thank you, Miroslav. Emily had a question here in the third row. Oh, sorry. Yuri first.
But ladies first.
Okay, here we go. Ladies first. This is Notre Dame.
Wow, this is a lot of pressure for my question now. My question for you is, what do you see as the role for religious peace building and bringing an end to the conflict in the Donbass?
What do you see as the role of religious peace building to bring an end to the conflict in the east of Ukraine? That's what you mean. Yeah, in East Ukraine.
In
the role of Christian religious peace building in East Ukraine, the conflict.
East. Well, that's a good question in the sense that we, of course, we pray, the churches pray for their survival. Churches support soldiers with chaplain, sent many chaplains. It's important. Then there is some material support to meet their needs, soldiers' needs there. And I know that the Pope himself sent some money to support our soldiers. At the same time, there is a problem with one church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. I saw several times that when 1 minute of silence and commemoration of soldiers who died there, who were killed, is announced in the audience, all people stand up, yes, except for hierarchy of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate. Unbelievable. Unbelievable, because it means that they are not representative of Ukrainians in the Moscow Patriarchate. They represent the Russian ideas in Ukraine. So I couldn't believe that it is possible, but it is possible. So as you see, there are different situations.
Thank you. Very last, very brief comment or question.
Father.
Reverend.
Dear Miroslav, I just wanted to address something which has been addressed by the previous person who raised a question concerning Donbass. Actually, you are speaking as someone who represents the country at war. The country, about 6% of the territory of which has been either annexed, like the Crimea, or invaded, like the eastern parts of Ukraine. And you spoke about the traces of communism in contemporary world, in contemporary Ukraine, and in what we call post-communist area. So my question is, with this incredibly difficult, vexing problem of being attacked, and viciously, which is supported by the official Russian propaganda, spreading downright lies about Ukraine, including the Ukrainian churches. How do you view the current situation and the current problems? What do we have to do with? Is it still the traces of communism, or is it something new? Are we not observing the emergence of some new threat and some new danger? And I'm asking this question in particular because I'm thinking, for instance, about the persistent emphasis which the official Russian propaganda makes on, in quotation marks, traditional values, which so quickly traps the so many religious people, for instance, in North America, into the trap of traditional values, which is again actually in its essence a downright lie and a play with senses and meanings. So what do we have to do with today?
Thank you.
What would be your view on this?
Yes, I know this problem, but what is important for me? First of all, the Kremlin ideology, present Kremlin ideology, which is just a replica of KGB country during the Soviet time. So for me, this logic, this propaganda, this country has no future, according to my understanding. I didn't believe in the future of the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was strong and powerful, and many people even were afraid of questioning the very existence of the Soviet Union. Now, I even more do not believe in the future of Putin's Russia. Why? Because they put three very important anti-Christian values or anti-values in the basis of their policies. I mean lies, hatred, and aggression, violence. So it cannot be representative or true Christian values if you use these three elements in your position. So I don't understand how this image of Russia, Putin, was created, that they support traditional values. Or I may say, did love, contrary to all three elements, compassion and truth, did they stop to be traditional values of our societies? So this is my reaction on this. I do not believe in the future of this ideology.
Thank you so much. No more questions, but it's very apt that the last question or comment will be made by our Dean. Microphone for Dean Appleby, please. wonderful way to end the evening with a Dean's statement.
As some of you know, Professor Sedmak is a punctilious timekeeper. He also knows that I love to exploit the platform of the Dean. So I apologize for this, but I'll make it brief. My comment, it's a bit of a commercial, an advertisement, and I go back to Emily's question, which I don't think there was a connection there. When she used the term religious peace building, this is a term that a number of faculty and students, both at Notre Dame and elsewhere, in Europe, I think, and also certainly the US and elsewhere, they're referring more to ground up efforts, from the ground up. Your wonderful presentation, for which we all thank you, has focused more, excuse me, at the level of elites, of governments, and of patriarchs. So the question, I think, is there hope? Is there an option? Is there a possibility in Ukraine or in Eastern Europe more generally, that what remains of maybe new generations of believers will have a presence that could be important and meaningful in conflict mediation, particular conflict resolution, and renewing the church from the ground up. And these groups finally are intentional, these religious peace builders. They have their methods, they have their networks, and they're most effective, of course, when they come from that society. Are you familiar with these movements? Do they have a chance to make a difference? And what would you say to encourage them if the first two premises make sense? Thank you.
By the way, now I understood more clearly your question. Let me start from the following point. We may speak about peace building in the East if we consider the conflict as an inner Ukrainian conflict, the conflict between Ukrainians. Then we may speak about peace building. But this is not the true explanation of the conflict in East. This is the conflict between Ukrainians and Russians. Because some, let's even say, some controversies, some tension, it was the reality between Eastern Ukrainians and the other part of Ukraine. They wanted exclusively Russian-speaking environment. They didn't want to study Ukrainian and so on. So it was from the very beginning. But this lack of confidence never transformed into military conflict. Only Russia transformed that into a military conflict. So when we now deal with that, the key for the peace building is not in Ukraine on this border, it is in the Kremlin. Our new president won the elections with a slogan that I will end the war. We will sit together with Putin, and that's all. I don't want a war to be held. But now he understands that he can do nothing because the key problem is the Kremlin and the Kremlin position. It is the fact in Eastern Ukraine, it is the fact in Moldova, it is the fact in Georgia, it is Russia all around. So that's why we cannot speak about truly peace building with active participation of Ukrainians here. But at the same time, I may say that there is so there is a group of priests in Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church that have authority to organize something like a center of peace building. And of course, they organize some meetings, they discuss all our hot problems, but this is more, so to say, what can we do if Moscow doesn't want peace? We cannot do nothing so far. But probably churches would have a lot of work if we have the different situation in Russia, and then we will have to work for peaceful reconciliation between Russian and Ukrainian people in general.
Thank you. 2 minutes. First, we thank Miroslav with a little gift. And the little gift is, it's not a book. It's not a bottle of wine. It's a rosary blessed by Father Jenkins, our president, with a handwritten note. He has a special relationship to Lviv and Ukrainian Catholic University ever since he came to see you. Thank you so much, Miroslav.
Thank you.
Secondly, the book winners are Kelly Regan. I'm so pleased. Tene Morgan. Where's Tene? Here's Tene. Wonderful. And Maria Camila Peralta. I know all three of them. This is providential. Lastly, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for your questions and comments. Special thanks to the members of the advisory board and our dean. Thank you to Miroslav and our team here, also the video recording. Enjoy the rest of your evening and the rest of your lives. Thank you.